The humidity in the room is a physical weight, a thick blanket of smelly New Delhi air. Under the hum of a single, struggling electric fan, a woman sits hunched over a desk. In her hand is a pencil, but she isn't writing a letter home. She's writing a letter from a home she's never seen, in a language she's meticulously imitating. She studies the chop, the official red ink seal on a captured Japanese postcard. With the precision of a surgeon and the soul of a novelist, she begins to forge the handwriting of a grieving mother in Osaka. She isn't just writing, she's planting a seed of doubt. She's Elizabeth Pete McIntosh, Betty to her friends, and she's currently engaged in one of the most sophisticated psychological operations of the Second World War. Outside the war, the China-Burma-India theater rages on a forgotten front, a brutal jungle combat and impossible logistics. But here in this quiet, sweat-soaked office, the weapons aren't lead and steel. They're rumors, lies, and very personal letters of men who believe they are fighting for an invincible emperor. Betty knows that if she can make a soldier believe his family has abandoned him or that his leaders are betraying him, he might do something the Imperial Japanese Army considers unthinkable. He might stop fighting. She pauses, adjusts the seal, and prepares the next blackmail letter delivery. Welcome to World War II Obscura. The story of the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, is often told through the lens of occupied Europe, the French resistance, the daring drops behind Nazi lines, the suave spies in London and Paris. But there was another war, one the Americans called the China-Burma-India Theater, the CBI, or as the soldiers called it, confused beyond imagination. It was a logistical nightmare and a cultural labyrinth. It was here that General William Wild Bill Donovan decided to launch his most experimental branch, morale operations, or MO. Donovan was a man who believed in dirty tricks. He knew that a military buildup wasn't enough to defeat an enemy as ideologically committed as the Japanese. He needed people who could crack the enemy's culture up, not just crack it open. He didn't want career soldiers for this. He wanted creative types, journalists, artists, and anthropologists, people who understood human nature and the nuances of language. Elizabeth Betty McIntosh was exactly what Donovan was looking for. A veteran reporter for the Honolulu Star-Bulletin, Betty had been on the ground in Hawaii on December 7, 1941, watching the smoke rise from Pearl Harbor and feeling the jarring shift of a world at peace into a world at war. By 1943, she was working in Washington, D.C., feeling sidelined and desperate to get closer to the action. Her break came in a moment she later described as kismet during a Department of Agriculture convention. While she was observing a display on chicken feather sleeping bags, she was approached by a friendly, elfin-faced major, she described him, who was looking for a specific kind of talent. After learning of her years of journalistic experience and first-hand knowledge of the Pacific, the major offered her a secret government role with the potential for an overseas posting. They didn't ask her to carry a gun. They asked her to learn how to lie. This encounter led to the secluded estate in Fairfax, Virginia, for intensive psychological assessments before she was sent to the farm in Maryland. There she mastered the arts of lockpicking, surveillance, and the unsavory craft of black propaganda. Once trained, she was shipped out to the sweltering heat of New Delhi to join a small pixie-like band of intellectual misfits that included artist Jane Foster and a young woman named Julia McWilliams, who the world would later know as the legendary chef Julia Child. Their headquarters in the New Delhi was often called the factory. The goal of morale operations was black propaganda, deception that was made to look like it came from the enemy's own side. While white propaganda was clearly marked as being from the Allies, black propaganda was a ghost. A newspaper would be printed to look like it came off a press in Tokyo, complete with the right paper stock and the subtle linguistic quirks of a Japanese editor. Radio broadcast would claim to be a Japanese station, but it was actually beamed from a hand-cranked generator in the Burmese jungle. The genius of Betty and her team lay in the ability to target the man within, the enemy soldier, the son, the husband, the father, rather than the abstract brute of military propaganda posters. One of her most potent projects was known as Operation Blackmail. It started with a pile of pitiful mementos taken from the bodies of fallen Japanese soldiers or captured in overrun camps. There were family photos, good luck charms, stacks of dry, clean postcards that had never been sent. Betty would sit with these postcards, reading the simple, pencil-scrawled messages from soldiers to their families. What a shame the families will never receive these last messages, she once remarked. But the MO team saw them as an opportunity. They would take these authentic cards, study the handwriting, then alter the messages. They would forge letters from wives back in Japan, hinting that the food was gone, that the government was lying to them, or most devastatingly, that the wives were being forced into service for high-ranking officers while their husbands rotted in the jungle. These forged letters were then surreptitiously reintroduced into the Japanese mail system. Imagine a Japanese soldier starving and diseased in the Burmese monsoon, receiving a letter that looks exactly like it came from his wife, telling him that his sacrifice is meaningless and his family is suffering because of the very leaders he is dying for. That was the blackmail. The impact of this work was often hard to measure in the moment, as the fruits of one's labor were leaflets sent out to be tossed from the bomb bays of an airplane, or letters planted on a dead enemy courier. By understanding the deep, almost spiritual dedication the Japanese had to family and tradition, Betty's team could craft lies that didn't just annoy the enemy, they shattered his worldview. They were storming the beaches of the mine. As the war progressed, the operations grew more ambitious. One of the most dramatic involved a Japanese courier in the jungles of Burma. Betty hired Burmese gangsters to kill these mail couriers. She paid them in opium. The OSS needed them to plan a fake order, a black directive, that would convince Japanese units to surrender or retreat. Betty helped craft a forged surrender order, making it look like an official decree from the high command. To assure it was found, they didn't just drop it. She ordered the killing of a selected courier so that documents could be discovered in his mailbag. She even worked with a surly Japanese prisoner of war to ensure the language of the order was pitch perfect, using the prisoner's bitterness against his own side to help create the deception. In 1945, as the Japanese army began to crumble, some soldiers actually walked out of the jungle clutching those forged orders in their hands. The work was not without its internal friction, though. The CBI theater was a boiling pot of confusion. The Americans and the OSS often clashed with the British, who viewed the Americans as uncontrollable. In the midst of this, Betty was promoted, eventually becoming the head of morale operations for the entire theater, a stunning achievement for a woman in an era where most female service members were relegated to clerical work. She navigated the politics of Kandy, Calcutta, and eventually China, where she worked alongside artists like William Smith to provide materials for field teams. She was a woman in charge in a world of Wild Bill Donovan's dreamers, a group she described as not good enough for heaven, nor bad enough for hell. The atmosphere of their work was a strange mix of the mundane and the surreal. In one moment, Betty might be typing up reports on the scarcity of rayon and the design of war shoes back in the States to keep her journalistic skills sharp. The next, she was sitting at her desk trying to focus on a radio script that would convince the Japanese garrison to commit harikari, or mass ritual suicide. The moral weight of their black propaganda was never far away. While they didn't see the blood on the battlefield, they were the architects of a different kind of carnage. The propaganda specifically targeted shattered souls in the jungle, urging them to relinquish a hopeless cause while planting rumors of their officers living in luxury. The end of the war brought its own set of challenges. When the news of the atomic bomb and the subsequent Japanese surrender reached them, their pixie-like band of friends began to scatter. Betty remained in China for a while, writing for the official station History for Donovan while dodging the opening salvos of the Chinese Civil War. She watched as the liquidation of the OSS began under National Security General Order 93. The agency had been her home, and her purpose was being dismantled. Yet the friendships forged in that confused beyond imagination theater lasted a lifetime. Betty, Jane, Paul and Julia Child, and the others remained a tight-knit circle, bound by the secret knowledge of the invisible war they had fought. Betty lived to see the declassification of the documents that proved the effectiveness of Operation Blackmail and her team's other dirty tricks. She never lost her dry, scathingly wicked sense of humor, often dismissing the pompous or the incompetent as schnooks. Betty matters because she reminds us that a war is not just a clash of machines and numbers, it's a clash of stories. The OSS Morale Operations Branch understood that the most powerful weapon in any arsenal isn't always the truth, but a very convincing lie. Elizabeth McIntosh and her team didn't just fight the Japanese army, they fought the narrative that kept that army together. They showed that empathy, when weaponized, can be as effective as an artillery barrage. By understanding what the enemy loved, what they feared, and what they believed, the blackmail team was able to reach across the lines of combat and touch the human underneath the uniform. History is often big-footed by the generals and the politicians, but the invisible war of the OSS was won by the writers, the artists, and the dreamers who knew that a well-placed rumor could save more lives than 1,000 bombs might kill. Betty went on to become a living legend inside the CIA. Retiring in 1973, they brought Betty back to headquarters in Langley to celebrate her 100th birthday. She wrote 2 books about her life, Undercover Girl in 1947 and Sisterhood of Spies, The Women of the OSS in 1988. Betty McIntosh passed away in 2015, a national treasure who had spent her life in the shadows. She once said, "Never again would I feel so alive, so completely engaged in something I knew would never come around again. She was a pioneer of psychological warfare, a woman who led men in a time of crisis, and a ghostwriter of the history we think we know. If you want to see more forgotten stories, hit like, subscribe, leave a comment with a person or mission you think I should cover. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is larger than we can ever imagine.
Well, I've done a lot of things that to me were important. I've written 4 books, and I've worked for, well, I worked for CIA too, but I can't talk about that. But I think the one that sort of, I keep thinking about it, was the work, the morale operation we did against the Japanese soldiers in Burma, who were fighting us in northern Burma, and they would not surrender. But we came across a document from one of their stations, and it was a government document that we could revise and rewrite. And we got some, we were able to get a Japanese prisoner of war to help us work on it. We finally got this document which stated that under certain conditions, like when you run out of ammunition or when you're completely surrounded, if you're wounded, you may surrender, and the emperor will forgive you. And it was all very properly stated, as if it had come right from Hirohito himself. And we were able to get it into behind the lines by planting it on the body. They killed this man. He was a runner for the Japanese who was taking their material to them, put it in his sack, and then one of the Burmese went and told Japanese soldiers that this man had been killed, but that they should go and get him. And then the Japanese soldiers went through his packet and found this. And they saw him going through it and talking about it. And then at the end there, the Japanese were beginning to surrender in Burma.